This panel will address how the private sector and one not-for-profit government regulatory body has led the world in creating capacity and connectivity during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're also going to address how policymakers and industry can work together to connect the more than 18 million Americans that lack access to high-speed broadband at such a critical time when you think about students, workers, businesses that have to rely on the internet during this extraordinary year that we've experienced. My name is Jim Brady. I'm the Vice Chairman at Alliant Group, tax consulting incentive firm. Also, we provide professional services for accounting and back office. I have 4 members of this fabulous panel. They're each going to introduce themselves and talk about their organization and how they're going about impacting, connecting this divide. Susie Armstrong, the Senior Vice President of Engineering with Qualcomm. Brent Olson, Vice President of Global Public Policy with AT&T. Evan Schwartztraber is a policy advisor with the Federal Communications Commission. And Rick Zimmerman is Vice President of External and State Affairs with NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. So I'm going to ask members of this panel to start off by just talking a little bit, Susie, if you can kick us off, about how your company goes about trying to create this connectivity that we're going to cover in this next hour. Susie?
So thank you very much, and it's an honor to be invited to speak again at the Chamber. I really love all your events. So Qualcomm, of course, creates the innovations behind the world's wireless technologies. And of course, the focus for the last number of years has been on the R&D and then the commercial products for 5G. And in this pandemic, I think the pandemic has really highlighted both the importance of strong connectivity. For example, what if this had happened actually 10 years ago, and has also hit the accelerator hard in the need for additional connectivity in the areas of telehealth and distance learning. 5G really gives a path to and beyond, in conjunction with the fiber plant and other types of broadband. We think that 5G has the opportunity to really pull us all out of this set of issues that we have faced with the pandemic. For example, parents. I mean, every parent out there is really living the reality of why we're so happy that this pandemic didn't happen 10 years ago when we did not have connectivity, and has really highlighted the importance of having increased connectivity and increased use cases. For example, remote learning has largely gone remote. A lot of healthcare has gone remote as well. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for much more enhanced remote learning and enhanced healthcare in the areas of, maybe perhaps utilizing augmented reality, which requires, 5G types of speed and latency. So I think it's a very timely topic, unfortunately, with this pandemic. But I think the U.S. is poised to, in the deployment of all these technologies around 5G and wireless, I think the U.S. is poised to really take advantage of this, not only for connecting people, but also economically. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. Brent, you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And I think you wanted me to address some of the things that AT&T is doing to address the pandemic before we get into some of the policy issues. And so with that, since the beginning of the pandemic, AT&T has been taking a number of steps to make sure that Americans remain connected. We provide both wired or wireline broadband and wireless broadband, including 5G, as Susie described. We're in the middle or the beginning of deploying 5G. We've actually nationwide 5G network up and running now. But since the beginning of the pandemic, we've maintained a COVID-related website that outlines all the activities that the AT&T Corporation is engaging in. But let me just describe a few of the most relevant actions here when it comes to keeping folks connected during the pandemic. So first, for several years, we've offered access from AT&T, which provides a low-cost $10 per month wireline broadband service to qualifying customers. And we have temporarily expanded eligibility to include households participating in the National School Lunch Program, Head Start, and those with income of 135% or less than the federal poverty guidelines. On the wireless side, Cricket Wireless, which is one of our main prepaid portfolios, has offered both new and existing Cricket customers a family plan that includes 4 wireless lines of unlimited data for $100 a month. And for a period of time over the summer, we were also providing 4 free Cricket Icon phones to go with that. And then finally, on the broadband provision front, we've extended our data overage waiver for AT&T Fiber and AT&T Internet customers through the end of the year, in recognition that some of our customers may still be experiencing economic hardship due to COVID-19. For schools and those faced with the challenge of home learning, we've created a variety of discounted mobile and wireline broadband offerings aimed at schools, students, and teachers. We've also created a $10 million distance learning fund and initiated a matching gift program supporting distance learning projects in low-income communities. We've supported schools and connectivity for about 380,000 students now, including K through 12 districts, departments of education, and colleges and universities across 43 states. And we're giving back to teachers, nurses, and physicians. And starting in July 10th, we had our teachers were able to join first responders and active military and veterans with eligibility to receive our appreciation offer of 25% savings on qualifying wireless plans. So we've really focused on those kind of first responders, frontline caregivers, and teachers to alleviate the burden of the pandemic. And as I mentioned, we've done a $10 million distance learning fund. $1 million of that we donated to the Khan Academy to support distance learning. We've also supported a variety of projects in low-income school districts through Donors Choose. And then finally, I think I'd mentioned that we continue to support, and I know we'll get into this as we continue the conversation, but we continue to support legislative action to address broadband accessibility that COVID-19 is exposed. And we believe ultimately that bold legislative action is needed and that Congress should provide sufficient funding to finally close that rural digital divide, but also modernize and reform universal service programs that are focused on affordable broadband connectivity for all Americans, such as the Lifeline program. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Jim.
Great. Thank you, Brent. Evan, from the Federal Communications Commission point of view, same opening. How do we connect all Americans?
Well, thank you, Jim, and thank you to the Chamber for having me on this great panel. The FCC's #1 priority under Chairman Pai's leadership has been closing the digital divide. He made that clear on day one of his chairmanship in January of 2017. And we do that in a variety of ways. One is by modernizing outdated regulations. Another is targeting our Universal Service Fund to areas that are truly unserved. And we are 2 days away from the beginning of the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund auction on October 29th, which is a $20 billion fund that will represent the Commission's largest ever effort to date to close the digital divide, potentially bringing connectivity to 10.25 million Americans, both small businesses and homes. And of course, we can't have this conversation without talking about COVID-19 and the importance of connectivity. And back in March, when it became clear that millions of Americans would be shifting to telework and distance learning, and millions of Americans would unfortunately be losing their jobs either temporarily or permanently, it was critical that the FCC take action. And Chairman Pai showed tremendous leadership in launching the Keep Americans Connected pledge, which nearly 800 broadband providers in the U.S., representing the vast majority of subscribers, they took that pledge. And that pledge involved not disconnecting customers due to their inability to pay because of the pandemic, waiving any late fees, and opening up Wi-Fi hotspots. And this was a tremendous public-private partnership that helped keep Americans connected during a unprecedented time, as well as actions to free up spectrum on a temporary basis, both in rural and urban areas, to meet increased connectivity needs of wireless providers, waiving gift rules in the E-rate program and rural healthcare program to encourage donations, and a bunch of other regulatory steps we took. But it's really a combination of those things. And while the Keep Americans Connected pledge was extremely important for keeping Americans connected, we do have to make sure to bring connectivity to those Americans that remain on the wrong side of the digital divide. And the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund is a big part of that. Today, we just voted on an order approved to establish a $9 billion 5G fund for rural America to make sure that rural America does not fall behind when it comes to next-gen wireless connectivity. And happy to get into more detail later in the discussion, but it really is a multi-pronged effort, modernizing regulations, targeting USF programs, and then, of course, responding to COVID-19 to ensure that Americans have the connectivity they need to access healthcare, education, economic opportunities, and more.
Rick, thank you very much, Evan. Rick, similar opening for the Internet and Television Association point of view.
Sure. Thanks, Jim. Thanks to the Chamber and my fellow panelists. So, first of all, I agree with what's been said before. I want to separate a little bit, what we have done to get Americans connected and then what we have done to keep Americans connected. In terms of getting them connected, NCTA, the Internet and Television Association, the association for whom I work, we represent some of America's largest broadband providers. And we have deployed broadband, made it available to 90+% of the country. And we have gigabit downstream networks available to 80+% of the households in the country. So that is a change from about 2016, when maybe 4% of homes had access to a gigabit availability downstream. Now it's 80+%. So we have been working hard, investing billions upon billions of dollars of private risk capital in order to make high-speed internet access available across the country wherever we can. But in terms of keeping Americans connected, Evan mentioned the Keep Americans Connected pledge, and all of our companies were subscribers to the pledge. The pledge is now expired, but all of our companies are in some form or fashion continuing the spirit of the pledge with respect to disconnect policies, with respect, in some cases, for free service to low-income providers for a particular period of time. I'm not going to get into the specifics for each of our companies. They all vary a little bit, but late payment waivers, a number of things to keep folks on the network. We also have, all of our companies have some form of program targeting low-income subscribers, probably the most famous of which is Comcast Internet Essentials program. I'll talk in the later section of this program about a partnership we have, a nationwide partnership with the education community specifically. But the gist of Comcast Internet Essentials program, Charter Spectrum Internet Assist, Cox's Connect to Compete program, and similar programs for our other companies, is that qualified low-income individuals can get a greatly reduced price for broadband service, and millions of customers across the country are taking advantage of that. And for most of our companies, in the context of the Keep Americans Connected pledge, those that qualify get 60 days free of service to help them, through the pandemic. I did want to say a note about the, pandemic itself. I mean, what we found on, in our case, I think March 16th was my first day working from home. It's probably the same for many. But as we have been working and learning and healthing from home, the networks have truly survived a real-time and unexpected stress test. And I know in our next section we're going to talk about why that was, but I think to the surprise of some of the, the tech blogosphere that is sometimes hypercritical of private providers and private companies generally, the networks not only held up but really surpassed everyone's expectations about how well things have gone.
Well, Rick, that's a great segue. I'm going to come to you, Brent, and then I'll come right back to you, Rick. But America's broadband networks, as Rick have said, have held up remarkably well over the past, I guess, we're 7 months since that mid-March date where we all went home and stayed for quite a bit. And can you tell us a little bit, Brent, on why this has been the case? Fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think Rick was alluding to it, and I think it's we have competition between multiple networks. We're lucky enough to have competition, but not just luck. We've had a policy choice that's led us to having competition between multiple networks, multiple broadband networks, and a diversity of network options available to most Americans. You think about both wired options with cable, with fiber, with DSL. And other flavors. You also have wireless, robust competition coming from wireless and within wireless. And for AT&T specifically, just to show you what that gets you a lot of investment. We've invested more than $135 billion over the past 5 years. And industry as a whole has invested over $1.7 trillion over the past quarter century. And this isn't just happenstance that this occurred. We've had an environment, a policy environment that's been enabled through a light regulatory touch that Evan spoke about. And this started in the Clinton administration with the Kennard FCC. And that light regulatory touch affirmatively recognized that broadband was not the same thing as plain old telephone service. And therefore, we should affirmatively and not reflexively or robotically treat the broadband network as such and subject it to that heavy-handed level of regulation. As a result, we've ended up with boom investment, continual investment, even when we faced tough times economically, both now and as well as the recession 2009, 2010. Broadband providers have continued to invest, and what we have is network capabilities that, as Rick said, have withstood the stress test of the pandemic. We had about 30% or so increase in usage, but also the type of usage that we were seeing was different. We had people moving, not working from the city centers. We had people working from the suburbs, working from their homes. And so the network that we had in the different areas scoped out was able to withstand that because it's been built to not just handle. It's been built with all that investment to handle today and tomorrow's demand. So I think this is a purposeful result. It's one we should slap, pat ourselves a little bit on the back. It's a collective patting on the back. There's a lot of reasons for it. And just for comparison, in Europe, over certainly the beginning of the pandemic, there were concerns. There were concerns that the networks over there weren't up to handle the surge, and there were requests and close to mandates from regulators telling providers to lower the utilization of video and things like that, so that the bids could get through. We didn't need to do that in the U.S. Instead, the U.S. was able to handle the demand, and we're still able to handle the demand going forward. Now, I know I'll end by saying there are issues that we need to address. The pandemic has exposed some frailties when it comes to those that don't have service, and those tend to be rural Americans. And we should finish, as I alluded to in the beginning, finish the job of building out to those Americans. But that's going to take some help from government in terms of providing helping deal with the economics of building out to rural America. And then two, there are Americans, even where networks are available, that are not subscribing. Some of that is income, and as Rick and I described, that many providers have programs trying to support that, but it's going to take a more comprehensive tackle from the government to get at that. It's going to take, we would say, a modernization of the Lifeline program, plus some real focused adoption programs to get people to understand the relevance, to understand digital literacy and the like going forward.
Great. Thank you, Brent. Rick, you want to pile on?
Sure. And so, I mean, I agree with Brent even more so than usual. The networks performed swimmingly. We have on our website at ncta.com a COVID-19 website, a network performance tracker that we put that folks can check state by state on how the networks are doing. But the trick is that in addition to the competition, the factor, the light touch regulation dating back to the Clinton administration, and in particular also continued and effectuated by the Chairman Pai FCC. What we have is networks that have been engineered, for peak capacity and beyond, and we have not ever reached that peak. What we saw during the pandemic actually was some changes in the characteristics of the data traffic flows. So whereas before the peak may have been in the evening because of everyone streaming Netflix and YouTube, it shifted a little bit to time of day wise. And we also saw an increase, a modest increase in upstream traffic because of all the Zoom calls and everything else that's going on. But interestingly, and I want to mention this one policy point before I continue, we have seen calls on the part of some public advocates and others that, all networks in the future or all grant programs should, or any government subsidy programs should only support symmetric speed networks, which are not typically the way that networks have been built in the past and may or may not be in the future in certain instances, certain applications. But the part of the theory behind that, I think there's the sort of the easy to understand theory and maybe the more cynical theory. Part of the theory is that, well, gee, everyone's video conferencing from home, so we need higher upstream speeds, and therefore grant programs need to support that. But what we have seen in terms of actual data usage is that the ratio has changed from about 20 to 1, 20 fold downstream traffic, mostly because of video streaming, to about 16 to 1. So really, even with the very large increase in upstream traffic, it's still a 16 to 1 ratio of downstream. So the manner in which one might ascribe good intent to advocates here is certainly that there's an increase in upstream speeds, and therefore they think there ought to be more upstream. Those of us that have been around Washington a long time always maybe think a little more cynically and recognize that if you change the definition of broadband such that broadband is defined as 25 by 25 or 100 by 100, then it turns out that no one actually has broadband. And if no one actually has broadband under the government definition of broadband, then it's free reign for regulators and policymakers to institute all sorts of crazy ideas on what they think ought to happen. So I think that the FCC has been on the right track in terms of their definition of broadband, the way the networks have been built, the way the networks have been used. And we have seen, throughout the pandemic, again, that actual usage has demonstrated that our networks and the regulatory process that has brought us here, the pro-innovation, pro-investment policies have really, for those that have access and do subscribe, as Brent pointed out, there are some areas we need to address. But for those that are online, it's really been much better than folks had any reason to expect.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you, Brent. Susie, that's a good segue, Rick. Again, the overarching notion behind connectivity is that buzzword 5G. So, Susie, could you just talk a little bit about the applications of what 5G can provide Americans globally, all citizens, as benefits?
Sure. So, we actually, the other panelists also mentioned the affordability gap and the not just the lack of connectivity in rural areas, but also for people who aren't necessarily connected. And I just also wanted to mention that we worked very closely at the start of the pandemic with San Diego Unified, which is one of the biggest school districts in the country. And it was an interesting observation that, and I think it's long been made, this homework gap, where there's actually a lot of students who don't have reliable Wi-Fi and reliable connectivity at home. And this was brought into sort of laser focus with San Diego Unified. And so we partnered with them. They were very interested in getting their kids connected with cellular. And clearly right now, because 5G has a limited footprint in terms of deployment, it was for 4G. But that was interesting because their other observation and our other observation is, and I'm not bashing Wi-Fi because I use Wi-Fi all the time, but Wi-Fi for the homework gap and for people doing remote work had before the pandemic, that was typically in places where people gather, where you couldn't gather anymore. So kids couldn't go to the library to do their homework, and you couldn't go down to the local coffee house to do your remote work. And so I think that's the cellular connectivity ended up in a very practical way for San Diego Unified to be their choice for how they pivoted quickly to providing all of their students connectivity. And I think that was an important lesson. And the other important lesson was, all the E-rate programs and such were very welcome because a school district like San Diego Unified, they were providing the data plans, and also the data plans that carriers like AT&T and companies gave these school districts were instrumental. So I think people have to realize when your local school district is asking for donations and equipment donations and such, it's not enough to just give them the equipment. You also have to give them the connectivity. Having said that, 5G is the silver bullet for all that ails us. I'm not sure it's the silver bullet for all that ails us, but we're pretty excited about it. And one thing we are very excited about is 5G comes along with the ability to use millimeter waves. And there's been a lot of discussion about, well, millimeter wave technology is only usable in urban environments. And we've been doing trials with a number of carriers, first in Australia and then with US Cellular up in Wisconsin, and building out using millimeter wave and using some of our chipsets in partnership with Ericsson, what we call extended millimeter wave. And that's millimeter wave that goes up to, we got in that trial over 100 megabits per second at a distance of 5 kilometers. And so that has a huge promise to US Cellular and to rural and suburban areas for connecting, schools and town halls. And we also think it's potentially an option for connecting the last mile, or as I call it, down the driveway. There's a lot of good fiber plant throughout this country, but there's a lot of issues with connecting that last mile or connecting, rural and suburban houses. And so extended millimeter wave and fixed wireless, little boxes you sit on the outside of your house, I think really has a chance, without digging up the last mile or digging up the the driveway of connecting rural areas as well as dense urban environments. And then, of course, the longer term thing we're so excited about is not just, connectivity for remote learning and, faster download of your video and such, but also for the kinds of economic gain you by, innovative advanced manufacturing and private networks and some of these and device to device kinds of communications, which brings in, precision agriculture. So I think it's important to look at connecting people and making sure people have, fast and robust connectivity. But I think you also, it's good to look forward to see what some of these use cases will be that will help sort of the macroeconomic picture.
Thanks, Susie. In fact, Brent, Evan, Rick, anybody want to pile on, since 5G is for better, faster, cheaper, as we connect the 18 million who aren't connected? Anybody want to pile on 5G?
Yeah, I'd be happy to say that, yeah, we don't see 5G as a silver bullet, of course, but we do see it as part of the solution for closing this digital divide. And we've worked on that in a variety of ways. One was approving the T-Mobile Sprint transaction, which included commitments by the combined company to build 5G to 99% of the U.S., or the U.S. population, rather. Then we also recently held the 3.5 gigahertz CBRS auction. And one of the interesting things about that auction was that you didn't just see the largest companies in the country going after, New York, LA, Chicago, and gobbling up licenses there and then calling it a day. You saw a lot of interesting companies participating, from WISPs in rural areas to critical infrastructure companies that want to, build private networks, to even some educational entities as well. And the efforts the FCC has done to push spectrum out into the marketplace will make 5G usable not just in America's largest cities, but also in rural and suburban areas. And we also just took a recent action, speaking of spectrum, today, to free up TV white spaces to be used more for broadband connectivity as well. So whether it's freeing up spectrum for Wi-Fi or for white spaces or for licensed 5G or unlicensed 5G, we do see it as part of the solution. And we also have seen millimeter wave spectrum being used by providers, not just cellular providers, but also fixed providers like Starry in cities, but also WISPs in rural areas too. So it does take an all the above approach. We do believe 5G is going to benefit rural America, which is why we launched the 5G fund, to make sure that those places that wouldn't see private investment otherwise do see that. And we're going to keep executing on Chairman Pai's 5G fast plan to make sure that we have this all of the above approach to bringing connectivity to more Americans.
Thank you.
And Jim, I just wanted to jump in quickly to make a couple of points, and I think Evan, hit it at the end, sort of, all technologies, all of the above approach. One thing to keep in mind, and we're certainly supporters of 5G, both in terms of policy, but also physically and the network. Because one thing to keep in mind, both with 5G and pretty much any cellular technology, is that only a very small portion of any particular transmission, data transmission, voice transmission, whatever it is actually truly wireless. And 95, whatever the statistics are, 98% is really over a wired network because of the backhaul and everything else that goes on. And so I know we'll be talking about some permitting reform, streamlining other regulatory impediments, or what the FCC and policymakers can do to make it easier to deploy fiber. But you can't have 5G without fiber. So we have to keep that in mind. But I also wanted to say just a couple words about Wi-Fi. And I know Susie talked about Wi-Fi, more kind of Wi-Fi outside the home. But first of all, to praise Evan's boss and the FCC on the amount of spectrum that they have made available, and I believe are still in the pipeline, unlicensed spectrum for Wi-Fi to enable 160 megahertz channels for Wi-Fi and gigabit Wi-Fi, et cetera. One thing that folks should keep in mind are that within the home, almost every device that you are using is connected by Wi-Fi. You might have one or two devices that are connected hardwired if you have a wireless broadband connection to your home, or even if you have cellular, then you piggyback off of that with Wi-Fi. And I don't know the latest, Cisco statistic of 15 devices in the home, whatever it is. If I don't include the sensors for my, home security system, we're at 25 plus devices. Now, they're not all connected at any one time. I have three teenagers and, even before the pandemic, but now, of course, my wife's a teacher, my three kids are all online learning, I'm on Zoom calls or team calls all day. But it's very normal to have 20, 25 devices within the home when you count gaming systems, Internet of Things devices that Susie mentioned, appliances, et cetera, et cetera. So Wi-Fi hugely important in the broadband ecosystem.
Yeah, and if I could just add really quickly, I think you make a really good point. I was not trying to bash Wi-Fi, since my preferred device when I have to travel is both. It's a MiFi device, right? It's a hotspot with cellular out one side and Wi-Fi out the other side, and that has saved our lives. And in fact, many of these school districts, if anybody in April tried to purchase a Wi-Fi, MiFi hotspot, you could not buy them for love or money. And I think that indicates the importance of the combination of these technologies.
And I just close, on the 5G point by saying, look, 5G is important because it's not just the next G. I mean, we're going for 4G from 5G. It's not just going to be more speed. It's a really new enabling technology, and Susie was touching on this about lower latency applications, being able to handle a greater number of connections at one time off a single tower. I mean, it's going to take wireless to another level in terms of what you're able to do with it. It will really enable, I think, telehealth, real latency sensitive applications, remote driving, things like that. That you can't necessarily do with 4G. This is going to be a big deal. Now, Rick and others are right that at the end of the day, the strength of American policy is not on picking a particular technology, but allowing them all to flower and pushing 5G while we're also not pushing down other technologies. We certainly agree with that.
Okay, that was a good around the horn on 5G. I'm going to jump over to the FCC, Evan, and get into the regulatory regime. And the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has developed a white paper on connectivity that calls for smart regulation. So, Evan, how does regulation impact investment? And you've touched on this already a little bit earlier. And can you tell us what the FCC is doing and will continue to do to promote the investment in 5G and throughout all things connectivity?
Well, there are a lot of costs to building a broadband network, and that's one of the challenges with connectivity, particularly in rural areas. And while the FCC can't, magically reduce the cost of digging a road or welding steel, we can reduce the cost of regulation. And some of those costs are purely red tape. Whether that's getting approval to build fiber or cable networks, or whether it's the cost of hanging a small cell on a light pole, or the cost of swapping an antenna on a macro tower to upgrade from 4G to 5G. And the FCC has tried to remove costs from the system as much as possible so that regulation is not the item where a company says it's either profitable or unprofitable to build somewhere. One of the big things we did, of course, was repealing Title II regulations, which, as Rick mentioned, there was a lot of folks in the tech blogosphere who said the world was going to end. You saw some of that rhetoric today because we responded to a narrow remand from the D.C. Circuit on our court victory on that subject. It was a victory, despite what you read on some of the tweets. But that was one big thing. I mean, Title II came with not just a morass of regulations, but the constant threat of rate regulation, of new unbundling requirements, basically anything the FCC might do at some point to a broadband network, which makes it difficult to get financing. It makes it difficult, especially for smaller providers, to build. Then we took action, to make it cheaper to deploy on utility poles with One Touch Make Ready. And then we've taken multiple actions on the wireless front, both on macro towers and on small cells. It's really just about removing regulation cost from the system. And that's something we absolutely believe is essential. It's one of the reasons why we've seen investment increase after the brief detour into utility style regulation, when we saw the first decline in investment outside of the context of a recession. And under Chairman Pai's leadership, we've seen small cells proliferate, tens of thousands more than in prior years. We saw fiber deployed at record levels in 2018, and then that record was broken in 2019. We've seen speeds double. You see the results from the light touch regulation. And as Brent mentioned, across the pond, our friends in Europe, they take a very different approach. They take a Title II approach. They take a top-down government-run style of regulatory policy, where you might have one network that is heavily regulated, broken up into wholesalers, not as much facilities investment. You see half of the per capita investment as you do in the United States. And, maybe that flew under the radar for a while, but when it comes to COVID-19, you see those results. You see the results of having facilities-based competition. So, as long as Chairman Pai is in charge, we're going to keep this light touch regulatory approach, because it does lead to the investment we need to have a thriving broadband ecosystem.
Outstanding, Evan. Thank you for that. And I thank you for the light touch that's coming out of the FCC. This next question, I'm going to ask you to go first, Rick. But I'm going to pull a few of you in, kind of moving from technical to more of a human nature question. We have access issues on the one hand and adoption on the other hand. Most communities across the U.S. have access, but research is finding that many communities, particularly those of color, are not adopting broadband even when there's access. So, Rick, if you could start off, why is this, and what is the solution?
Sure, and it's a multifaceted problem, and I do want to address that problem. I did want to piggyback on one thing, though, that Evan said with respect to polls. And, I know many people tuned in today to hear about poll attachments, so I am going to make their wish come true. So there are two things. One is in the hands of the FCC. The other is really in the hands of Congress. The item at the FCC, NCTA actually has a current petition asking that the FCC clarify its rules on when a poll, investor-owned utility-owned poll, must be replaced. Who pays the cost of that poll? Because under the current regime, the rules say that there ought to be a proportionate cost sharing, cost causer pays, etc. But some utilities have interpreted the rules to say that the attacher must pay the entire cost of the poll, even though the vast majority of the benefits of a new poll go to the poll owner. So I don't want to get too in the weeds, but it's an important thing that the FCC could deal with. But what Congress must deal with is the fact that the 1978 Poll Attachment Act left municipally owned polls and cooperative owned polls unregulated by the FCC or anyone else. A handful of states have taken action to regulate co-op poll rates or muni poll rates, but a recent study showed that co-op poll rates tend to be 3 times higher than the rates of investor-owned utilities. And the problem is most co-ops by design are located in more rural areas, which has a less dense population, which means essentially polls per person, which means higher costs if we're going to deploy. And we want to be spending money on fiber, not on wood, in effect. So we'd like Congress to act. So let me get back to your question, a very important question on adoption. So all the studies have shown that lack of adoption is sort of a multifaceted problem. Part of it is, as hard as this is to believe for those of us that are, steeped in broadband, all things broadband all the time, every day, is lack of interest on the part of some people. Part of the issue is lack of digital literacy. Part of the issue is lack of devices. Some people, fear the internet in the sense of identity theft or privacy concerns and issues, and sometimes it is cost or affordability. But it's a multifaceted problem and generally not just one issue with respect to any particular family. That's the reason that Comcast, for example, again, or our other companies, or AT&T, as Brent mentioned, created programs like Internet Essentials that are multifaceted programs to deal with all of those issues. But I did want to mention one thing specifically, which is a new partnership that was announced about 6 weeks ago with Education Superhighway, which is a nationwide nonprofit that was originally founded to get schools connected to the internet. But the cable industry on September 10th, I believe, announced a partnership with Education Superhighway that is along the lines of the low-income programs that we had out there, except those programs were always based on connecting an individual family. And in these new programs, what we have are what are known as sponsored service arrangements, or sometimes they're known as bulk billing arrangements, whereby a school district pays for any low-income or qualified family to be connected to the internet. In the first of the instances, major instances, Chicago, the city of Chicago, which is one of the very largest school districts in the country, struck a partnership with Comcast, and funding came from various local foundations, the Pritzker Foundation and others, a similar deal in Philadelphia with local foundations. What we have seen since then is states around the country using CARES Act money. There was $16 billion dedicated for education purposes. I know Chairman Pai has spoken about this and about the chairman and the FCC's partnership with the Department of Education. But through those programs, funding is made available to connect multiple sets of families. The problem always was that as a provider, we don't know who is low income or not low income. And similarly, the school doesn't know who does or does not have broadband. And, surveys turn out to be not very accurate about that. But basically, by working in concert, in partnership, they are able to overcome those issues. So there's a whole set of parameters that I won't get into. Folks can go to the digitalbridgek12.org website to hear about the K-12 Bridge to Broadband program, but it's really doing a great job of getting families connected.
Can I pile on since Jim's on mute?
Sure.
Pile on, please.
I'm an opportunist. So I just wanted to support what Rick is saying there. I think you said your wife is a teacher. My sister is. Yeah. My sister is a teacher as well, and I think, from talking with them, from looking at the policies around, and from working with a number of school districts around the country. I think there's a lot of benefit, as you point out, in what I call, teaching the teacher, or, working with the healthcare providers, not necessarily directly with the communities you're trying to reach, because those teachers are community leaders, and school districts are community leaders. And I think that actually goes a long ways to, the three things that you listed: the digital literacy, the lack of devices, and the cost, in terms of educating, families and students and people who use healthcare, in terms of you want that education to come from the community leaders that they know and respect, rather than, some set of techies who says this is what you actually need. And so I think that working through the leaders in these organizations, teachers, administrations, I think should have a lot of results, because they are trusted.
Very good. Brent, I'd love to get you in here.
Yeah, thank you. I think Rick kind of addressed the multifaceted nature of adoption, or problems with adoption. But I totally fully agree with that. Let me zero in on certainly income is one of them. And I mentioned this at the beginning, so let me just zero in on kind of AT&T's view on trying to deal with the income gap, if you will, or the ability to buy broadband problem. There's an existing program, the Lifeline program, that the FCC administers pursuant to its duties under the Communications Act, and they've been ably doing that. But it's a program that was initially built in the mid 1980s and was built for telephone service. And the FCC, like I said, ably has tried to reconstruct it for broadband underneath, following the strictures of the statute, to make it as up to date as possible and make it available for broadband. But we really think now is the time to fully modernize the FCC's Lifeline program. There's a couple main aspects to that, and without getting into all the details, we have some blogs on AT&T's policy blog if you wanted to get more details. But there's a couple things. One, FCC is restricted on its funding structure. It has to collect universal service funds through essentially a tax that's put on top of consumers' telephone bills. Well, this is a set of services that's going away, not increasing. So you're increasingly having to increase the amount that they're putting on those bills as they go away. It's not modern. It's not built for the future. It's again trying to be able to provide a funding mechanism based on the restrictions that you have, as opposed to Congress that can kind of figure out a new funding mechanism. And we would say this should be through appropriations, because the amount of money that the FCC is dealing with through the USF fund is, around $10 billion a year. And if you think about the programs we talked about before, which is Funding Rural America, which is one of the programs that FCC administers through the Universal Service Program, plus Lifeline, these numbers can get pretty big pretty quickly. So it should be funded through appropriations. And by the way, broadband benefits everyone in our country today. There's no reason to second it to a particular type of provider or funding mechanism. Two, and this is probably the equally important, is the current program is provider specific. In other words, certain providers participate in Lifeline and then they seek a subsidy once they've billed the customer on behalf of for funding for getting compensation for providing the service. We think there's a better model. It's the SNAP card that the Department of Agriculture adopted back in the 90s to replace food stamps, an electronic benefit that is given directly to the customer, to the consumer. They can go around and shop for the best broadband that makes sense for them and their family, just like folks use their SNAP cards to go to different grocery stores around the country to choose their nutrition needs for themselves and their families. There's no reason in our mind that broadband can't be purchased the same way. And you'd be able to eliminate a lot of the administrative costs associated with the current Lifeline program that way, and you wouldn't have to chase waste, fraud, and abuse from a provider perspective, and it would get out there a lot more easily. And I think with that type of program, you could really increase the participation level, because right now, Lifeline, even though SNAP is a eligibility criteria for participating in Lifeline, less than half the people that participate in SNAP actually take a Lifeline benefit as well. So there's a lot more I can get into. I know we're getting close to the top of the hour. And again, I point you to our AT&T policy blog, but I think this is an area where we're really pushing for the Congress to take up next year and to fully modernize going forward.
Thank you, Brent. Yeah, that 55 minutes flew by, so it's 3:56 Eastern time. Let's do this. This is a very, very quick question, but why don't you each take a minute? I think the question is a one-word answer, but then link it into your closing remarks. So, Susie, maybe you go first. But here's the quick question. We heard quite a bit of talk in the news recently about nationalizing or wholesaling communications networks. Is this a good idea or a bad idea? So that would be a one-word answer, and then go into any closing you'd like to have, Susie.
3 words. It's 2 words. Bad idea.
Okay.
I'm sure that everything I could say about this has already been said on one side or the other. So I'll just say, bad idea from both my point of view and the company's point of view. I think we, as was discussed here, are thriving in the area of connectivity. I think there's lots of opportunity for 5G and beyond, but the pandemic has shown that we are really doing a good job here in the U.S. And I guess from a closing point of view, just wanted to take a step back a little bit and point out also that number one, policy matters. Policy matters for connecting all Americans. Policy matters in these light touch regulation and polls. People do want to hear about polls, Rick. Policy also matters for the R&D that actually goes into building these products and these technologies. Without that R&D, you don't have the standards, you don't have the inventions, you don't have the ability to squeeze all this data into this spectrum, and you have nothing to deploy. And it's an area that the U.S. has traditionally led in terms of, high tech and semiconductors and 5G and wireless communications. And it's of paramount importance. I know Evan's from the FCC and we're talking about deployment, but it's also of paramount importance that we have policies that continue to support that R&D. So we have something to deploy. So thank you.
Thank you, Susie. Brent, good idea or bad idea, nationalizing?
Yeah, it's an unnecessary idea. I mean, the bottom line is, and the power of the American communications network landscape is what I mentioned at the beginning. We have diversity of networks, we have competition, we have constant investment and innovation because we've had a light regulatory touch framework that has enabled companies to take risks and to constantly innovate and update the capabilities of our networks. We take it for granted where we are many times in terms of our capabilities of our network. But if we took a breath, and maybe COVID's allowed some of us to do that, and look back at the things that you could do today, or compare the things you could do today to things you're doing 5-10 years ago, it truly is monumental. And that's not an accident. This occurred because we have an environment that encourages multiple networks to take risks, to invest, and to innovate. And there's no reason. In fact, there's a lot of downsides, a lot of dangers to throw that concept out and to replace it with something that's not tried or true, which would be nationalizing or networks. We should be we're appreciative of what we have and foster it instead of replacing it.
Thank you, Brent. Evan, the light touch regulator, I think I know your answer.
Chairman Pai does not support nationalizing 5G networks.
Right. Thank you very much. Closing comments, Rick?
Well, I'll just say that, if you look at government-owned infrastructure generally, the American Society of Civil Engineers has, I think, a triennial or quadrennial report card, and it usually gets a D-. It's literally trillions of dollars of underfunding in roads, highways, bridges, ports, airports, etc. The one shining sector for infrastructure is the not government-owned sector, which is broadband. And as Brent mentioned, $1.7 trillion of private risk capital, et cetera. So I think we can be justifiably proud of how well the networks have performed. Our work is not done. As everyone has indicated, there are folks that don't have access, and a lot of programs underway to try to rectify that. And there are folks that have access that are have chosen or unable to subscribe, and programs for that as well. But in general, the technical state of the networks, the performance of the networks is really much better than any of us could have expected in what I referred to earlier as a real-time stress test. So, everything that has led us up to this point has worked very well together, beginning with the Clinton administration through we'll call it the Pai administration now. And we look forward to continuing to serve.
Thank you, Susie, Brent, Evan, and Rick, for an outstanding Connecting All Americans panel. Thank you to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So, fellow Chamber colleagues, hope you enjoyed this panel. And with that, we're going to sign off. Thank you. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.